At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches EP24. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 2. 49 Wilson, September 17, 1946. After school, insane. Perhaps he was. Insanity was his curse. It was the thing he feared above all else. He would never be cured. The strange thoughts that once sunk him into new realities had taken hold. Each was a florid daydream, not viewed as a movie but lived in the first person. He was always the main character, elevated and heroic, a delusion of grandeur he supposed. He liked it that way. It was much better than a mundane life. So if the thought still came, how was he to say he was cured? A true delusion was a fixed false belief that gained traction like a tire on the road. It drove a person in different directions, often toward disaster. He became more like a glorious Ferris wheel, taking him to new fantastic views of life, but unable to alter his direction or fundamental beliefs. He was stone-cold sane. In fact, he wagered he was safer from insanity than anyone else. Others could still fall and become lost in the mental maze, but he couldn't. Wilson. Ravens or crows? Her sharp voice cut his thoughts. He was sprawled on the floor, stuck in a nightmare. He weakly tilted his head and stared at the woman that peered down at him. He expected to be instantly drawn in by her piercing violet eyes as he usually did, but surprisingly he wasn't. He squinted at her dim orbs, before realizing her violet eyes were gone. "Mother, is that truly you?" he croaked, slowly lifting his back off the floor. His entire body ached and he fell onto the ground again. "It cannot be, for last I remember, my mother's eyes were violet," he muttered under his breath. "Ravens or crows?" the witch repeated, her tone gentle and devoid of its usual sternness. Wilson furrowed his eyebrows and blinked repeatedly, wondering if he was hallucinating. When the witch jabbed his ribs with her feet, he realized he was not. "I don't know. Crows," he answered aimlessly. A dumbfounded expression spread across his face. "Is there supposed to be a correct answer? Those two birds are not comparable." "It's unfair," he said, rubbing his eyes to get a better look at the woman. There was no more denying it, she was the witch. The witch sighed and dropped to her knees. She placed her palm on Wilson's bloody forehead. "Incorrect. It's neither ravens nor crows, as I, the pagan witch, knows. However, given the current state of things, that is a paradox. I am no longer a pagan witch, so the only person in the world who truly knows is Yuta the witch." At the mention of his name, Wilson's eyes flew open. "Yuta? Where is he?" he frantically asked, as his blood pressure rose and boiled against the surface of his skin. "You will never learn the answer to that ravens or crows rhyme, Wilson," the witch said mystically, ignoring his comment. "Because soon Yuta will no longer be a pagan witch. Soon there will be no more pagan witches. So the answer to that question will remain unidentified. But where did Yuta go?" Wilson interjected harshly, lifting his head. "And why are you here? Where are your violet eyes?" he asked frantically, sitting up hastily. As soon as he jerked upwards, all the pain that was numb to him before suddenly bombarded his senses. Wilson squeezed his eyes shut and groaned as he waited for the anguish to subside. But it never did. The pain rushed through his body like an igniting fire, scorching and wounding his nerves. Never had he ever experienced such agony in his lifetime. His jaw clenched and he grabbed a fistful of hair to ease the agony, but it barely worked. "Wilson," the witch said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Yuta defeated you. He was the one who caused you all these wounds. He fled, although I will not tell you where. I made a promise." At her touch, the pain slowly faded away and he released his trembling hands from his brown locks. Sweat trickled down his face and his breathing returned to its normal rhythm, although there was a heavy weight every time he inhaled. Wilson placed his head in his hands when her words rang through his ears. "There truly is no hope for me, is there?" Wilson muttered, scanning his blood-stained fingers. Wilson clenched his jaw and clicked his tongue harshly, hoping it would hide his desolate emotions. "There truly is nothing left to do, right?" he asked the witch, turning to look at her as beads of tears brimmed his eyes. The witch sighed and nodded timidly, her eyes watering at the state her son was in. Wilson grunted and gripped the ends of his hair again, hoping the self-inflicted pain would give him an answer. "Tell me, Mother," Wilson said, rubbing his eyes tiredly. "What are you doing here? Are you alive or is this an illusion in my head?" "The shadow proved to be a useful pet after all," she replied, her warm hands caressing his bleeding face. "My soul has been wandering ever since my death. I happened to find the shadow today, who can take on many forms as long as it contacts a soul." "Oh," he said simply, rubbing the temples of his forehead. "But why did you come? Why did you choose today to talk to me again? Do you not know that I have missed you so much?" he asked feebly, choking on his quivering voice. "I did not come for you, Wilson Stevenson," the witch said, tilting his head so that it faced her. "I came for Yuta the witch. I came to help him. I am on no one's side but myself, which includes my fellow witches," she explained, with her usual poetic and wistful tone. "I used to be on the devil's side. I was on his side and I obeyed him for millions of years," she added, rambling endlessly. "But one day, I disobeyed him to retrieve my freedom. Because of that, I was punished in the afterlife. My soul can never rest in peace, it can only wander." "Why did you used to obey the devil so much?" Wilson inquired curiously, allowing the witch to ramble because it distracted his mind. "I understand that you were his creation, but you still had a mind of your own, right? I am not his creation. He turned me into a pagan witch," she clarified, her black eyes suddenly blazing. "I used to obey the devil because he was my lover long ago. I first met him during the dawn of creation, when the beginning of civilization was at its prime," the witch said, staring off into the distance as the memories replayed in her head. "Allow me to show you." The witch waved her hands and in front of Wilson, a white cloud formed. The apparition was no more than a distortion of the light. Where it hovered, the floor below it appeared bowed, as if he was looking through fish eyes. It had a smudging quality that rendered the image watery, like a reflection in a rippled puddle. He peered into the swirls and noticed that a picture had formed. Rather a memory. A 16-year-old girl sat on the floor of a forest, her tunic dress made of birch bark sprawled around her. She was with an older woman and together they wove crowns made of flowers and thorns. In the dappled shade of the forest, her hair was the color of the obsidian gems underground, tied into 2 dainty braids. Her eyes were bright like the violet flowers that swayed beside her, and it was difficult not to be pulled in by the youthfulness it emitted. Her skin was just as dappled, pale yet covered with so many freckles that she looked like a mystical fairy. "Mother, why are we pagan?" the little girl who Wilson assumed was the witch suddenly asked. Her mother wearily lifted her head and gazed at her daughter momentarily. If the little girl looked like a fairy, then her mother looked like a witch. Her hair was long and string-like, tumbling down her back like an obsidian waterfall and waving in the chilly wind. The intensely black hair that stuck against her ivory skin made a contrast that only served to make the woman look more ghostly. A ragged white knee-length tunic was the only piece of clothing draped around her lanky body. "We are pagan simply because there is no reason. We believe and pray to nature and her deities, just as our ancestors before us did," she answered solemnly, never averting her gaze from the crown of flowers she was weaving. "But why? Why do we believe that nature and her deities exist?" the girl asked, looking up at her mother curiously. "It is for the same reason I sing the ravens and crows rhyme to you," her mother said, shrugging nonchalantly. "There is no correct answer because only the pagan witch knows whether it's a raven or a crow. We trust that the pagan witch knows, although we understand that perhaps there isn't a pagan witch that knows. However, we still trust that there is a pagan witch that knows despite the chance that there could not be. That is what faith is, dear. We trust that nature and her deities exist, even though there is a chance they may not. Still, the trust that perhaps there is a chance they do is enough to keep those who do not know strong." The little girl paused her work to let her mother's words sink in. "What exactly is a pagan witch?" Her mother sighed and looked up from her work, staring straight ahead. "I know a great many things, but I do not know that. Ponder it yourself, dear. What do you want a pagan witch to be? Roam the depths of your imagination." The girl nodded and returned to her weaving. She thought about her mother's words and formed an image in her head of a pagan witch. Her imagination didn't run far, because the image she created was a woman like her mother, poised, strong, and beautiful. When she finished, she placed the crown on her mother's head and grinned. "I think a pagan witch is someone that looks like you, mother," the girl said, caressing her mother's face. Her mother wearily turned and faced her daughter. Her lips cracked into the first smile she had in a while, and it brought endless amounts of joy to the girl. At that moment, the ground beneath the mother and daughter shook slightly. The girl glanced over her shoulder confusedly and her eyes caught a couple of horses charging towards them. The girl jumped to her feet and grabbed her unaware mother. "Mother, we must leave now. I think the men on those horses are affiliated with King Stevenson. We will be enslaved if they find us in this forest," the girl whispered hurriedly. Her mother wearily nodded, but it took her many minutes to stand up. By the time she was on her feet, the knights noticed and approached the two women. "Hail, young ladies. May I ask for thou reason being in this forbidden forest?" The knight on the brown horse said, taking off his helm to reveal his wizened face. "We were hitherto about to leave, sir," the girl muttered, instinctively shielding her mother with her arms. Her pulse quickened as she spoke, not only because it was difficult to speak their tongue, but also for fear they would be punished. The other man on the white horse jumped off and took off his helm. He shook his tousled black hair and blinked as the sunlight hit his almond-shaped eyes. He ran a hand through his thick and lustrous hair, combing it. The girl met his gaze and she was instantly mesmerized by his glistening onyx eyes, with flecks of silvery light that performed ballets throughout. His face was youthful and defined, his features molded from granite. Rich fabrics were wrapped around his lean body, and he proudly showcased the jewels adorned on his chest. "I deeply apologize if we disturbed you," the man said chivalrously, outstretching his hand for the girl to shake. "King Stevenson appointed Sir Witchet and me to patrol the lands during our time off," he explained, his deep and smooth voice captivating the girl. "What is your name?" the girl feebly asked, struggling with her words. She released her hands from his and rubbed the warmth that he left on her skin. "Thou do not recognize him. This is the foreign Prince Yuta, who has recently been invited to scour the kingdom of Willesden," Sir Witchet introduced, gesturing towards the prince. Prince Yuta leaned forward so that all the girl could see was his courteous smile. "It seems that you and I are the same age if I am not misjudging," he remarked, his eyes scrutinizing her slender frame. He flashed her a smile that showcased all the good he stored in his heart, and the girl couldn't help but swoon. "Well, I suppose we should leave now." "Come, mother," the girl hastily muttered, turning to grab her mother's hand and hiding her reddened face. "Why is your mother walking so slow?" the prince asked, glancing at her mother worriedly. "She's sick," the girl explained, hiding her trembling hands behind her back when she faced him. "She's sick. Behead her, Sir Witchet," Prince Yuta ordered bluntly, without a flicker of uneasiness. "What?" the girl exclaimed, startled by his sudden order. She gaped as Sir Witchet approached the women, raising his sword in the air. "What are you doing? Stop." The girl outstretched her arms to push her dumbfounded mother aside, but she was suddenly grabbed by the waist and jerked backwards. As the girl squirmed within Prince Yuta's grip, Sir Witchet swung his sword forward. There was a flash of realization in her mother's widened eyes seconds before the sword sliced her head off. Blood spewed and splattered on the girl's white dress as she watched her mother's sudden death with horror. There was a moment of unnerving silence before the impact of the blow struck the young woman. To see her mother's headless body sprawled on the grass, and her unattached head inches away was torture to her soul. She didn't break quietly, it was like every atom of her being screamed in unison, traumatized that she should exist without her mother. From her mouth came a cry so raw that the previously chirping songbirds began weeping. "Listen, girl. You are a princess. Your mother would have held you back," Prince Yuta whispered in her ear, the warmth of his voice seeping into her soul. "Come with me and I'll be your prince." "What do you mean? I don't understand what you are talking about," the girl stammered, her body shaking as her teary eyes refused to leave her dead mother. "Allow me to show you the world beyond these trees," the courteous black-haired boy said. "Your mother would never be able to gift you the things I am planning to gift you. Riches, lands, gowns, and a handsome prince to be wed to," he promised, turning her so that she faced him. Prince Yuta smiled at her, his eyes shining as he outstretched his hand. The girl hesitantly shook his hand, still shaken by her loss but deciding that she needed a place to sleep in tonight. Perhaps the prince was right. Perhaps he could give her the life she desperately needed. The prince lifted the frail girl onto his horse and together they rode. She didn't know where they were heading, but she didn't care. Her head was muddled with so many grief-stricken thoughts that she didn't care what happened to her. She wanted to give her mother a proper pagan burial, but by the time she realized it, they arrived at the royal tavern. She quickly jumped off the horse and stormed into the tavern. When she entered, she was immediately swarmed by bustling servants and chaotic customers. She pushed past them and sat at a wooden table, holding her head in her hands as she quietly wept. "My lady, I understand that you are saddened by your mother's death," the prince said, approaching her from behind. He wrapped his arms around her, providing her with the warmth she desperately needed. "Yes, I am. Why did you order to behead her?" "She was simply sick. My mother and I had been praying to nature and her deities to cure her. She was just starting to feel better," she exclaimed, flashing him a hurt expression. "My lady, there is no cure for an illness like hers. Her time was over, so I lessened the blow by acting swiftly. You would not understand, for you are simply a girl. Besides, praying would have done naught," the prince said nonchalantly, as he slid onto the chair next to her and grabbed a bowl of soup. "But my mother said praying was helpful," the girl said, rubbing her watery eyes. Prince Yuta scoffed under his breath. "Praying to a divine being above the clouds does not work. The being you are praying to won't listen to your requests unless you are a king," he said, leaning towards her ears. "It's the divine being below the ground that will listen." "Huh," the girl muttered, blinking puzzledly. "Come with me, my lady. You should be glad that your mother is peacefully resting. Now you can dance all you wish," he exclaimed, swiftly jumping up to grab her wrists and drag her to the middle of the tavern. First she was skeptical. Prince Yuta noticed her skepticism and chuckled, holding her arms to spin her. The girl stared downwards and saw the hem of her dress spin with her, forming beautiful ripples and creases. It was a sight she never saw before. So an unprecedented yelp of surprise escaped her mouth. Wrinkles formed around the prince's eyes from smiling too hard. He spun her again, and this time, the world swirled in front of her eyes. The chatter and music filled her ears and she could barely hear the prince's excited words. The lights were twinkling with every step as she continued to spin in delicate circles, her white dress billowing out. Soon wrinkles formed around the girl's eyes because she was enjoying the dance too. The music soared around them and lifted them away from gravity. She couldn't count how many times she squished his foot under her own. Still, he smiled brightly as their heels clicked over the floor. He watched lovingly as her hair bounced with each beat. The other folks in the tavern hastily joined the pair. Although they were drunk and their dancing was sloppy, the girl giggled with the prince as they watched the other dancers, before returning to their own. "That was amazing, wasn't it, my lady?" Yuta asked as they walked through the vacant halls of the inn. "You are an elegant dancer," he remarked, sweeping his lustrous hair off his damp forehead. "Thank you," the girl said, unafraid to show him the blush that appeared on her freckled cheeks. "You were amazing too. You danced me around the moon and I never felt more alive than I did with you," she said, unable to hold back her genuine smile. "I have been praised on many occasions for my dancing, but when it comes from you, it delights me to no end," Prince Yuta said, chuckling shyly. "I am so happy to see a smile on your face after the events of the morn." "Indeed," the girl said, nodding giddily. After all the dancing, her heart was the lightest it had been in years. She stared at the prince with adoration, grateful for the way he cheered her up and changed her perspective. "Allow me to show you my chambers. You can sleep here with me for the night," Prince Yuta graciously said, a mischievous glint in his obsidian eyes. He opened the wooden door of his room and wrapped his hands around her wrist gently. He pulled her in and the girl gazed around the royal chambers. She had never seen a bedchamber like this because she was used to sleeping on a nest of leaves and flowers with only her mother to warm her. "This is where you sleep?" she asked, her eyes wide with awe. The prince did not answer. She figured he did not hear her. Plus, the girl was too engrossed with his luxurious bedroom to notice the prince's vanished smile. Prince Yuta crawled into the bed and unbuttoned his leather tunic. He pulled the shirt over his shoulders and laid on the bed, before gesturing to the girl. "Come, my lady," he called, in a commanding tone that lacked its usual playfulness. The girl nodded obediently and slid next to him, pulling the warm blanket over her shoulders. She sighed with satisfaction and snuggled into the cloth that warmed her blue fingers. The girl closed her eyes and whispered good night to the prince, falling into a swift slumber. A few seconds later she awoke screaming. A pair of icy hands were wrapped around her throat, depriving her of oxygen. The room was dark apart from a couple of candles, and she couldn't see his face, but she knew it was him. His gleaming black eyes stood out against the darkness and were impossible to miss. She continued to choke and fight back, but his grip was too strong and she was out of breath. When her face turned red, Prince Yuta finally released his grip. He locked her in place by jabbing his elbows against her body, preventing any resistance. They stared into each other's eyes as she panted heavily, and his lips curved into a smirk as he looked down at her. A deathly aura surrounded him and the girl was sucked into it, unbeknownst to his true intentions. Prince Yuta, she croaked, frigid tears spilling down her face. What are you doing? She whispered, her heart thumping with agony. Do not call me that, he hissed, his icy breath chilling her synapses. I am the devil. The girl blinked with surprise, baffled as to whether he was speaking the truth or not. She quickly realized the prince she had fallen in love with was not lying the moment his black eyes began glowing red. You are pagan and I know I am not misjudging, the devil said sinisterly, his face inches away from hers. I have been searching for a pagan person for centuries. I would have chosen your mother to be the one, but she was sick so I killed her. There is no use for a sick woman. I needed a young, innocent pagan person to be the one, and there you were, following my orders like a dog. The girl swallowed the lump lodged in her throat, and she felt a desperate need to soothe her burning neck. Unfortunately, all she could do was helplessly stare into his glowing eyes as he gripped her wrists tightly. What do you mean to be the one? She feebly asked, trembling under his menacing and powerful grip. To be a witch. My pagan witch, the devil said, rubbing his nose harshly against her bruised cheeks. Only pagans can turn into a witch by a collaboration with the devil. I desperately need a pagan witch at my side, so imagine my joy when I sensed you within my radius, he whispered darkly, as he grazed his serpent-like tongue against her ear. Without another moment of hesitation, he sunk his teeth into her neck. The child screamed as sluggish blood oozed from the wound and the pain jolted through her veins. His strong legs were intertwined with hers, so she couldn't kick away the agony. Her vision blurred and her head spun as the unpleasant aches gnawed at her stomach. She often prized herself in ignoring her wounds, but that was impossible. The pain owned her, dominated every thought, and controlled her quickening breath. There was a new strand of obsidian darkness that slithered into the crevices of her shattered soul, ensuring that light never resided again. He lifted his head after a while, her blood leaking through his teeth. Paganus Pythonism, he hissed, his scarlet eyes narrowing into slits. The pain suddenly vanished and she gasped, although the wound was still there. The blood dampened the bedsheet underneath her and created squelching noises when she uncomfortably squirmed. Then the devil grabbed her right palm and carved a mark on it using his sharpest fingernail. It was simply torturing. So much so that at one point she stopped screaming. A few hours later, the devil finished collaborating with the girl, despite the many horrid protests she made against his brutal acts. He cupped her face with his hands that were stained with blood and other gruesome fluids. His red eyes pierced her and he smirked evilly at her, satisfied with the taste of her blood. Your name is no longer the name your mother gave you. Your name is now the witch and henceforth you serve me. What the hell did you just make me watch? Wilson Stevenson muttered as soon as the cloud disintegrated. Is this true? Is this how you met the devil? And why is his name Yuta? That's a coincidence, is it not? My pagan powers do not lie, Wilson, the witch said, discreetly wiping her tears. This truly happened. I was simply a naive girl, unbeknownst as to what I had gotten myself into. Do you understand now why I had no choice but to obey him? Because you still loved him even after his betrayal. That is, until recently, Wilson answered, shaking his head softly. Why would you afterwards? Why didn't you try to find a way out of the curse he cast on you earlier? For the same reason that you chose not to find a way out of the curse I cast upon you, the witch simply stated, her black eyes gentler than the eyes of Prince Yuta. Hell on the earth, they both answered in unison, sharing a moment of sorrow. The devil cheated both of us. Whether Yuta the witch has a connection to the devil or not, there's no denying that he must die. Yuta must die, not only for the curse to end but also so the devil can cease his tormenting and trickery, she said, running her hands through Wilson's tousled hair. Wilson gazed at his mother, and judging by the creases on her face, she lost all the naivety she used to possess in her youth. It was saddening, and he wasn't sure whether she was happy with the outcome of her life. He felt an urge to pull his mother in an embrace, but he chose not to for no particular reason. He simply could not bring himself to. Perhaps I am insane. At this thought, Wilson slowly cast his gaze downwards on his trembling hands. His watery eyes widened, and the simple realization struck him. He was in a state of disbelief, defeat, and hopelessness. But why? I am not siding with one option or the other. I am not telling you to let go of your hope of receiving a son. I am simply telling you the facts, she said, pulling him forward so that his shaking head rested on her shoulder. I know you have missed me very much, Wilson. I know I will miss you very much when you die, regardless of the option you beg Yuta to choose. I simply want you to know that you will not die in peace despite leaving behind an heir, should you choose the first option. You will also not die in peace if you go through with the second option and Yuta dies. A gasp of surprise escaped his throat. He was in a state of disbelief, defeat, and hopelessness for no reason other than the understanding that the future he was going to have was bound to be ruthless. Not as horrid as his mother's, but just as tragic. So, that means you are free to choose which of the two ways you want Yuta and yourself to go. Do you want Yuta to kill himself in front of your eyes as you slowly disintegrate, or do you want Yuta to live for as long as myself and carry forward the curse as you slowly disintegrate? She asked, rocking his trembling body gently. Wilson wearily lifted his head off her shoulder and stared her straight in the eye, wiping the tears and blood. I want Yuta to live and carry forward the curse that used to bring me joy as I slowly disintegrate, he declared firmly, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes as his tensed limbs relaxed. The witch nodded solemnly, no emotion of protest or satisfaction present on her face. Very well. Go and persuade him using any means possible. Fate will determine what happens next, but you have a sliver of control regarding your fate, Wilson Stevenson. Wilson steadily rose to his feet, his knees wobbling slightly. He nodded at the witch, who sat on the floor, her black gown billowed outwards. She returned the nod with a heartwarming smile and waved him farewell. I shall see you on the other side, Mother, Wilson said wearily, with a hint of optimism that could be judged as insanity. His desires were selfish, but in the end, Wilson didn't need her to be a good person. He needed her to be his mother. If ignorance is bliss, then may I never find peace. Wilson, my dearest, you are not going to see me on the other side. You will only see Yuta the witch for the duration of your eternal afterlife. 250 Yuta. September 17, 1946. After school, it's time. The words Yuta spoke were forced up his throat, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth as soon as it escaped. His chest was tense and his breath came out in tight spurts, rendering it difficult for him to breathe. The gloom of the chilly room crept into him and seeped into his pores, shooting up his frigid veins. He grudgingly trotted towards the middle of the pool room, his legs shaking with every step as he approached the impending doom. He clenched his fists at his sides and stared at the white tiles below, hiding his tears from his friends. He felt as if he was running from something beautiful yet tainted, godly but ungodly, as it slowly whisked away all life on earth, leaving nothing but emptiness. When Yuta reached the middle of the pool room, he slowly lifted his head. Yuta gazed at his friends with his somber violet eyes, who gave a terrified look in return. Their faces were scrunched with despair and their eyes were wide with fear as their brains slowly registered the fact that perhaps Yuta truly was going to go through with this. His heart thumped sorrowfully for them, and the depressing question of what they would do afterwards suddenly struck Yuta. There were a few minutes of nothingness that allowed Yuta to soak in the last moments of his life. He stood completely still and gazed morosely in the distance, his eyes locked onto the closed green doors of the pool room. It was in these moments the despair was a heady blackness. The ways forward he had thought possible vanished to black as if they were never there at all. The notion of hope became meaningless because if his mind lingered on such ideas they began to feel like cruel tricks. The bonds he had, the ones that kept his heart beating, felt so thin and even they were a heavy weight to hold. There was no point in him drawing any more breath, not only because it was the plausible way out of the curse, but also because it simply felt right. In the darkness of his tormented and traumatized mind, he couldn't get a sense that anything was important at all. Not even life, death, or the devil felt threatening. He desperately wanted to see the dawn kiss the land and remind his fickle heart that he was not the only one here, that there were sentient beings on this planet that loved him. But he knew it was wrong for him to have that because all he deserved was a starless sky without a moon that could shine. Yuta continued to gaze at the green double doors that were stained and dark-toned. The doors reminded Yuta of Wilson's dim orbs during the moment in time when he nearly slammed the life out of him. It gave him great pleasure to see that frozen expression on his face, but that feeling of satisfaction lasted for mere seconds. Yuta had gotten his revenge against Wilson and he was about to end the curse, yet he felt numb. He didn't feel heroic because he was making a sacrifice, he felt nothing. It was as if he was standing on an isolated island, with nothing but the terrifying ocean to stare at. His eyes never averted from the doors as the sudden shuffle of movement could be heard around him. The moment of stillness was over, and now it was time for everyone to play their part, no matter how impossible it felt to do. Ronald carried Jimmy's corpse and laid him on the ground beside Yuta, straightening his frail body. When he finished, he stepped backwards and joined the others in the formation of a triangle. They surrounded Yuta, who continued to stand, and Jimmy, who laid peacefully on the ground. Carter grabbed Jessica's hand first, who grabbed Barbara's, who grabbed Josh's, who grabbed Olivia's, who grabbed Ronald's, who grabbed Carter's. The tight triangle they made somehow managed to leave enough room for Yuta in the middle. His friends tightened their grips around each other's hands and watched the dark-haired boy, waiting nervously for the next dreaded moments. Yuta's legs slowly sank downwards and he was on his knees. He focused his gaze over Carter's shoulder and straight on the green doors. He prolonged his next actions, partly because his consciousness was lost in the dark sea that was his mind. Although there was half of him that wondered. Half of him wondered, wished, hoped that someone would burst through those green doors and save him. Tears brimmed his eyes as half of him wished Mr. Stevenson would burst through the doors and save him. Not the monster that he turned out to be, but the man Yuta first thought of him as. As much as he didn't want to admit it, somewhere deep inside his heart, Mr. Stevenson gave him comfort. He was the type of man that was caring and could be confided in, like the father he always wanted. He was the warm embrace that Yuta instead received from the spirit of the witch. The idea of Mr. Stevenson was someone who Yuta inspired to be. The harsh slap of reality was the fact that Mr. Stevenson was a facade. There was no one like him in the world and Yuta could never be him, no matter if he lived or died. Yuta raised his right hand as his eyes glazed over and his vision blurred. He shakily snapped his fingers and murmured some words, which caused a knife to appear in his grasp. His heart hammered rapidly in his chest, the suspenseful beats aligning with the ticks and tocks of a clock, signaling that the doom of his fate was impending. For a split second, his eyes flickered towards his silently weeping friends. They all stared at him with quivering lips and teary eyes, but they did not look away. It seemed they intended to give Yuta the comfort of their faces until his very last breath, and Yuta was eternally grateful for that. Doing this to them pained him deeply, but he exchanged that pain with the beautiful memories they shared together, and hoped they would remember. Yuta inhaled sharply and raised the knife, leveling it with his eyes. His hands were tightly curled around the wooden handle, and the shiny surface of the steel blade reflected the light that emitted from the white ceiling. Yuta refocused his gaze on the double green doors, unable to find another comfortable place to look at. Staring at the weapon that would kill him was nauseating. Staring at his angelic friends was horrifying. And staring at the pool reminded him of wonderful memories that were daunting to think about at a moment like this. The green doors, however, felt like they were the gateway to heaven. Its uncleanliness and inability to remind him of much was comforting for the boy. He figured it would help him think of his passing as something minuscule and insignificant, thereby making the going easier. But there was another special thing about the doors. Beyond its insignificance and dull colors was a speck of hope that seemed to lay frightened behind an unseen coat of varnish. Yuta could never avert his eyes from that speck, and whether he would reach out to grab that speck or not, it brought him happiness. Genuine, timid happiness that could only be expressed through a slight upturn of his eyes. He brought the knife closer to his chest and shut his eyes lightly. The brightness of the room washed away in an instant, and suddenly his vision was coated with darkness. The tip of the frigid blade lightly pierced his black sweater, but before he could plunge further, the speck of hope he saw amongst the doors suddenly became bigger than a speck. It exploded and caused his shut eyes to fly open. The first thing he saw was the green double doors burst open with Mr. Stevenson sprinting through the doorway. "Yuta!" he desperately shouted, his bloody hands outstretched towards the boy that sat in the middle of a triangular formation with a knife in his hand. "Stop! Stop this! Don't kill yourself!" There was a cry behind that shout. An urgent, anguished cry. Yuta gazed into Wilson's alert green eyes, his grip on the knife frozen. Then he realized. His anger was nothing but a shield for the pain, because Wilson was a cornered man randomly blowing punches, scared for his life, lonely, desperate. "Yuta, please," Wilson cried, bolting towards the middle of the pool room. "We can work this out. We can talk for as long as you want. You don't have to make a choice today. You don't have to end the curse today. We still have until the end of the year. I want to die as much as you do, but I am not going to allow you to die when there's hope for life. Yuta, you can live if you choose the first option." Yuta smiled sadly at Wilson and repositioned his grip on the knife. As the man hurled forward and his friends' faces were locked in a grimace, the world blurred once more. Everything was occurring quickly, yet he suddenly realized what he had to be done. Although he got what part of him hoped for, Mr. Stevenson bursting through the green doors to offer him a chance at life, the hope of living could never be achieved for a boy like him. The speck of hope was another image in his head that was simply a facade. There was no hope for him in this world, no matter if he lived or died. So he decided to die. "Yuta, I am deeply sorry," Wilson yelled, genuine tears streaming down his face. "I want all of you to live. I truly do. Let me find a way. Let us make amends and try to find a way out of this. I cannot promise you there will be a chance, but Yuta, the fact of the matter is that the devil can be swayed. He can. Now that you're the new witch, there's a possibility." Wilson cried desperately, his brownish blonde hair slapping in the air. "All we need is more time. So give us more time, Yuta. More time with you, more time to talk to you, more time to persuade you. Please, Yuta. Give us more time." Wilson reached the students that encaged Yuta in a triangular formation. He outstretched his hands and reached over the children's shoulders, his bloody fingers sprawled midair. "Valen sempiternum. Te amo," Yuta whispered, although his farewell was loud enough for everyone in the pool room to hear. The moment Wilson Stevenson's hands passed the triangular formation, it collided with an invisible force field. The beam of transparent light was dented momentarily until it sizzled and bounced back in place. Wilson was shot backwards by the force of the rebound and skidded across the floor. His grief-stricken emerald eyes, gaping mouth and wispy brownish blonde hair flapping in the wind was the last Yuta saw of Wilson Stevenson's face before he crashed. Then, without another moment of hesitation, Yuta plunged the knife through his heart. The knife met his flesh, soft and pudgy, and made a sickening squish as the tip of the blade sank within. To his surprise, he felt little pain and only trickles of blood gushed from the wound. The blade was latched into his heart, blocking the flow of blood until he pulled it out of his chest. That gave him enough seconds to speak his final words before leaving behind the world. Yuta gazed around the room that was blurred and white. Death's icy fingers were holding him with a cold caress. It was a face he was taught to despise, yet it brought him comfort. Death caused no pain beyond what life provided. He was not greedy, rude, or rough like the devil. He merely carried him and placed his burning soul to a cool rest, where he was soon to lay benumbed of the greed and hatred of the living world. His lips curved into a faint, tragic smile as he gazed around at the family that surrounded him. Perhaps they would always share the same moon, no matter how many universes away they were. Yuta wasn't allowed the luxury of being selfish, and whilst the fate of the world had been restored, Yuta and his world bled out on the floor. Before pulling the knife out of his chest so that his life source could gush outwards and death could finish his task, Yuta uttered his final words. The words were for everyone. They were for his friends whose hands were tightly grasped together, and they were for Wilson Stevenson who lay on the floor, stunned. They were also for the dead Stevensons of the past, and they were for the dead pagan women of the past. They were especially for the devil and the witch, who always watched overhead sorrowfully. Her name is Vanessa. Vanessa the witch. All stories come to an end, but he ended his before the ink ran out. 251 The Witch. September 17, 1946 After school Vanessa. That was the name the courteous dark-haired boy she met during her girlhood gave her. Vanessa the Witch. That was the name the same boy who betrayed her and revealed himself as the devil gave her when he turned her into a witch. The final words of Yuta the witch resonated within Vanessa deeply. It was simple yet beautiful, and she couldn't be more pleased with the revelation of her true name. For that reveal truly set her free from the binds the devil placed in the afterlife she was living. It was not only Yuta's final words but also his final spell. Vanessa's sullen eyes flickered towards the boy witch. She watched as Yuta ripped the knife out of his chest. Although she was merely a spirit visible to some, she flinched and grimaced at the action. His cry was a deafening sound, guttural chokes mixed with an agonized roar. His friends that surrounded him were unable to react to the sound, because one faulty move would ruin the entire ritual. Their feet were planted firmly as Yuta dropped to the ground, convulsing as thick blood flowed freely from the hole in his heart. The cascade of the boy's life source gushed out in all directions, scarlet liquid squirting all over Jimmy, who lay beside him. His draining violet eyes flashed towards her momentarily, and she smiled warmly at him before his cries came to a halt. It was the final image he saw before the white light took over and the warmth left his body. His head dropped and the light in his eyes vanished, leaving behind anguish in Vanessa's heart. The boy knew that if he didn't sacrifice himself for what he wanted would become the sacrifice. Everything would have turned out terribly, had he not taken a step forward and allowed the fear to wash over. The difference between taking the step forward or not was everything, and over a lifetime it would define who one was. All those steps would build a strong soul, and soon being brave would become a way of being. In the end, Yuta was the bravest of them all. She groggily turned to walk towards Wilson Stevenson, who she knew would die next. She kneeled to the man's side and held him, sweeping away the hair that matted against his forehead. Her heart still stung from the witch boy's death, but she figured she could at least be by Wilson's dying side. Vanessa the witch. Wilson grumbled confusedly, tilting his head to see his mother approach him. That was your name this entire time. Vanessa, she corrected, nodding somberly. I am no longer a witch. As is Yuta. Vanessa, you were no witch to me. You were always my mother, Wilson whispered feebly, as he outstretched his hands to cup his mother's quivering face. But I already told you that, didn't I? He said, smiling faintly. His eyelids blinked slowly and they lingered on the face of his mother. A teardrop streamed down his cheek and splattered silently onto the floor. Vanessa squeezed her eyes shut as his lower body slowly disintegrated in her hands. He grabbed onto the hem of her black dress as his mother rocked him back and forth soothingly. Thank you, Wilson, she murmured, stroking his wrist. Her bony fingers traveled downwards to caress the devil's mark upon him, which was surprisingly warm. As her son disintegrated, particles, that looked like dark rose petals, drifted into the air and intertwined with the ordinary dust. She had seen this sight numerous times with her previous sons, but it never pained her as much as this. She held Wilson with caress as he slowly died and studied her son who hated her for 200 years. At that moment she couldn't recall why he hated her. Perhaps it was when she scolded him for running away from the forest in his childhood. Vanessa's heart shattered as she recalled the regret present in Wilson's eyes during her dying moments. A choked cry forced itself up her throat, and she desperately wanted to assure her son that she was never angry at him. But there was so little time left. With every thump of her heart, another limb of his disintegrated. Wilson looked up at Vanessa with sad but knowing eyes, understanding that there was nothing that could be done. His mother smiled at him, her black eyes glistening with comfort that Wilson desperately needed during his last moments. The disintegration crept up his torso and his dress pants slopped onto the varnished floor. I love you, Mother. Vanessa squeezed what was left of him tighter, and his mesmerizing emerald eyes blinked one last time before he slipped away into death's grasp. She hugged Wilson's empty clothes tightly and stared at the ground where she held him in her arms moments ago. As silent tears streamed down her cheeks, she noticed that death had left her a gift. A single black rose laid upon the floor, where her son once was. She mournfully folded Wilson's clothes and placed them on the floor. She picked the delicate flower and held it to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Vanessa groggily rose to her feet and walked towards where the children were standing in a triangular formation. She was a wandering spirit, so the others couldn't see her walking through the force field with ease. She approached the fallen Yuta and held the boy as he slowly disintegrated. There was no denying it. The boy looked identical to the human form the devil took. It was partly the reason for her attachment towards him, but she also pitied him. She pitied the innocent boy who she wrongfully gifted her powers for her own personal gain. And she sincerely regretted doing it. "Goodbye, Yuta the witch," she whispered sadly, stroking his soft black hair. At last, fate, like an overtired mother who was sick of giving gentle hints to unheeding children, brought down her hand heavily upon Yuta and Wilson. They were cradled in her wizened hands as she carried them up to the skies. A final embrace before their souls left their body. A beautiful black rose remained where Yuta once was, and she picked it up. Vanessa stared at the two blossomed roses, not shriveled like the rest. Her thumb pricked on one of the thorns that were as large as a falcon's talon. Everything about the rose was utterly black. From the stem to the tip of the bud it was black. It was healthy and fully blossomed, yet it was black. She lifted her gaze from the roses and brought her black eyes towards the children who were shaking in their spots. They let go of each other's hands and watched Yuta's lifeless body disappear. The room was filled with a sorrowful silence until Carter fell to the ground and broke down crying. His wails were agonizing and raw, enough to make everyone beside him fall after him. Jessica sunk to her knees and hugged Carter as they sobbed. Olivia crashed onto Carter's right side, with Barbara following after, both of them shaking as tears poured out of their hurting souls. Josh and Ronald collided against each other, weeping so hysterically that it overtook the sound of the water splashing in the pool. It was more than crying. It was the children of desolate sobbing that came from a person drained of all hope. Their tears mingled with their blood and their gasping wails echoed around the pool room. The pain that flowed from them was as palpable as the frigid wind. There was no struggling to keep their tears silent, and they let it flow freely instead. The mourning would continue for years, and they would never grow numb to the pain. It was a fact everyone felt at that moment, and no one tried to fight it. Vanessa rose to her feet and left the children to mourn by themselves. There was nothing more for her to do or help with. It was a strange feeling, being absolutely liberated, yet still burdened with the deaths of her loved ones. She solemnly walked through the gray corridors, her gaze cast on the black roses that were the only remnants of her children. Vanessa pushed open the heavy doors of the school exit and was instantly met with a cool breeze. As Black Raven soared over her head, she noticed the town of Willesden had changed. The once gray-hued skies were now bright blue, just like it had been before September 3, 1246. Even the grayish school building itself brightened as if the deaths of Yuta and Wilson lifted the dark mist it was coated with. The environment was more friendly than before, and it reminded her of the days during the dawn of creation. Earthy, mystical, and peaceful. When the sun rose to cast the trees in their virescent hues and brought the warm brown tones back to the earth, Vanessa felt something new. It was as if invisible holes were poked in her skin during the night and all her tension leached out by dawn. Her steps were lighter and she tilted her face towards the brilliant shafts breaking through the canopy above. Perhaps this is happiness. This is what comes after a battle is over, Vanessa muttered to herself, her eyes glistening against the golden sunlight. At last, after many centuries, the Devil's Pact had been diminished. End of Part 2.